The Atlantic Ocean in 1949 was supposed to belong to America. The U.S. Navy had just won the largest maritime war in history, built the world's most powerful surface fleet, and developed sonar systems that could supposedly detect submarines from miles away. Then Soviet diesel-electric boats started slipping past every listening station like they'd discovered invisibility. The problem wasn't the submarines themselves. American intelligence knew exactly what the Soviets were building. Project 6113, the Whiskey-class boats, displaced 1,350 tons surfaced and could dive to 560 feet. They carried 18 torpedoes and a crew of 54. Nothing revolutionary. The British and Americans had built similar designs during the war. What made them ghosts was something the Navy hadn't anticipated. The ocean itself was hiding them. Active sonar worked fine in shallow coastal waters. Send out a ping, wait for the echo, calculate distance and bearing. But in the deep Atlantic, that ping traveled maybe 2,000 yards before scattering into useless noise. Passive sonar, just listening for engine sounds and propeller cavitation, worked even worse. Below 300 feet, there was a layer of water called the thermocline, where temperature dropped sharply enough to bend sound waves back toward the surface. A submarine cruising beneath that barrier might as well have been on another planet. Admiral Forrest Sherman stood in front of a classified Navy board in October 1949 and laid out the mathematics. The Soviet Union was building 30 submarines per year. Most were diesel-electric boats designed for one mission: sink the cargo ships that would carry American troops and supplies to Europe during the next war. If the Soviets could position even 50 boats in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, they could strangle NATO before it fired a shot. And the U.S. had no reliable way to find them until they surfaced to attack. The Navy tried everything conventional. They added more destroyers with better sonar. They deployed patrol aircraft with magnetic anomaly detectors that could sense a submarine's steel hull disrupting Earth's magnetic field if the sub was within 300 feet of the surface and the sea was calm. They dropped hundreds of sonobuoys, disposable hydrophones that radioed back what they heard for a few hours before sinking. Each sonobuoy cost $400 and covered maybe a 5-mile radius. The Atlantic Ocean spans 41 million square miles. By early 1950, naval intelligence estimated the Soviets were running transit exercises with their new boats, sending them from Murmansk down past Iceland and Ireland to test NATO's detection capabilities. The exercises worked. Tracking stations in Scotland and Newfoundland picked up nothing. A Whiskey class could cruise at 6 knots submerged for 3 days on battery power alone, completely silent, except for the faint hum of electric motors that dissipated into ocean noise within 500 yards. Then it would surface at night, run diesel engines to recharge, and disappear again before dawn. The Americans had the ships, the technology, the entire infrastructure of naval dominance. What they didn't have was a way to hear what was moving beneath them. And in the deep ocean, if you couldn't hear it, it didn't exist. Frederick Hunt wasn't looking for submarines when he started mapping how sound moved through seawater. In 1932, he was a 28-year-old acoustics researcher at MIT's physics department, trying to figure out why underwater communication systems failed so spectacularly. The Navy wanted reliable voice transmission between ships and divers. What they got was garbled static that cut out completely at random distances. Hunt set up tanks in the basement of Building 6, filling them with seawater he hauled from Boston Harbor in galvanized buckets. He'd place a speaker at one end, a microphone at the other, then spend hours adjusting water temperature and salinity while recording how sound waves propagated. His colleagues thought he was wasting time. Sound in water was just slower and louder than sound in air. Everyone knew that. The variables Hunt obsessed over, temperature gradients, pressure differentials, dissolved minerals, were academic curiosities, not engineering problems. But Hunt kept finding patterns that didn't match the textbooks. In April 1933, he noticed something strange. When he heated the top layer of water in his tank to 68 degrees, and kept the bottom at 48 degrees, sound waves at certain frequencies wouldn't travel straight across anymore. They curved downward, then bounced off the bottom and curved down again, trapped in a repeating arc. The sound stayed louder, traveled farther, lost less energy to scattering. It was like the temperature difference had created an invisible tube that guided the acoustic waves. Nobody cared. The Navy funded research on hull designs and torpedo guidance systems. Hunt's acoustic propagation studies earned him exactly $1,200 in grant money for 1934, barely enough to keep his tanks filled. He published his findings in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in December 1934. The paper got 2 citations over the next 5 years, both from Hunt himself in follow-up studies. World War II changed the equation temporarily. The Navy needed every acoustic advantage it could get, and Hunt's research suddenly had a purpose: help find German U-boats. He joined the National Defense Research Committee in 1942 and spent 3 years developing better sonar transducers and testing them in actual ocean conditions off Massachusetts. The work was classified, urgent, and ultimately frustrating. No matter how sensitive they made the hydrophones, submarines kept disappearing into acoustic dead zones nobody could predict or map. Hunt learned something crucial during those war years, though. In August 1944, during tests 200 miles east of Cape Cod, his team dropped a hydrophone down to 2,700 feet, much deeper than standard sonar operations. They were trying to hear a practice torpedo that had missed its target. Instead, they picked up the propeller sounds of a cargo ship that was, according to radar plots, 480 miles away. That shouldn't have been possible. Sound attenuates with distance. At 480 miles, those propeller cavitations should have been undetectable static. Hunt wrote it down in his logbook. Deep channel propagation. Verify mathematics. Then the war ended, funding dried up, and everyone went back to dismissing ocean acoustics as unpredictable noise. Everyone except Hunt. He'd heard something travel nearly 500 miles through seawater, and he needed to know why. Hunt returned to MIT in September 1945 with a problem that wouldn't leave him alone. Sound had traveled 480 miles through the ocean, clean enough to identify specific propeller blade counts. That violated every acoustic model the Navy used. He needed ocean data, real measurements at depth, across long distances in different water temperatures. The Navy wasn't interested in funding it. They were too busy mothballing destroyers and cutting research budgets. Hunt borrowed a research vessel from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in March 1946, loaded it with war surplus hydrophones and 5,000 feet of cable, and headed for the continental shelf. He spent 6 weeks dropping hydrophones to different depths, while a second vessel sailed in expanding circles, detonating small explosive charges. Each blast gave him an acoustic snapshot of how sound propagated at that depth and distance. The shallow results matched predictions. Sound scattered, weakened, disappeared within a few miles. But at 3,000 feet, something impossible kept happening. Explosions detonated 60 miles away arrived at his hydrophone louder and clearer than blasts from 20 miles away at shallower depths. The sound wasn't dissipating, it was being channeled. Hunt pulled every oceanographic survey he could find, looking for the pattern. By July 1946, he had it. Ocean water temperature decreases as you descend from the warm surface, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit per 100 feet in the Atlantic. But water pressure increases with depth, and higher pressure makes sound travel faster. Those two effects, cooling slowing sound down, pressure speeding it up, created a zone around 3,000 feet where sound velocity hit a minimum. Right at that minimum depth, sound waves naturally refracted back toward the center line, trapped between the warmer water above and the higher pressure water below. It was a natural waveguide, a horizontal tube of seawater that stretched across entire ocean basins. Sound entering that channel at the right angle would bounce between the upper and lower boundaries indefinitely, traveling thousands of miles without escaping into the dead zones above or below. Hunt called it The SOFAR channel, sound fixing and ranging. The depth varied by latitude and water temperature, running as shallow as 2,000 feet near the poles, as deep as 4,000 feet near the equator, but it existed everywhere in the deep ocean. Hunt published his findings in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in October 1946. Long-range sound transmission in the ocean. The paper included propagation charts showing theoretical acoustic ranges exceeding 3,000 miles at frequencies between 10 and 200 hertz. He proposed applications for underwater communication, rescue beacon systems for downed pilots, maybe even scientific studies of marine mammals. He didn't mention submarines, not in the published paper, but in a classified supplement he sent to the Office of Naval Research in November 1946. Hunt spelled out the obvious. If you put hydrophones in the SOFAR channel, you could hear every submarine in the Atlantic. The Office of Naval Research sat on Hunt's proposal for 7 months. When the response finally arrived in June 1947, it was 3 sentences long. Interesting theoretical work, potential future applications, no funding available at this time. Translation: the Navy had no interest in planting microphones on the ocean floor based on one physicist's temperature charts. Hunt tried again in 1948 with more data. He conducted additional tests off Bermuda proving that low-frequency sound at 3,000 feet could be detected at ranges exceeding 800 miles. He included acoustic signatures from actual submarines. American ones volunteered for testing, showing that diesel engines produced distinctive cavitation noise between 7 and 100 hertz that propagated perfectly through the SOFAR channel. The Navy thanked him for his research and suggested he focus on improving active sonar systems. The problem was cultural as much as technical. The admirals running naval procurement in 1948 were surface warfare officers who'd commanded destroyers and battleships during the war. They understood steel hulls, gunfire, and aviation. They did not understand spending money on microphones attached to cables anchored 3,000 feet down in the middle of the ocean. Admiral William Fechteler, Chief of Naval Operations, made it clear during a March 1949 appropriations hearing the Navy needed ships, not experimental listening stations that might work if the ocean cooperated. Hunt's proposal seemed absurd on paper. He wanted to install hydrophone arrays at 20 locations across the Atlantic, from Greenland to Barbados. Each array required specialized cables, coaxial bundles carrying dozens of hydrophone signals, plus power lines, all sealed against saltwater corrosion and pressures exceeding 1,300 pounds per square inch. The cables had to run from shore stations out to the continental shelf, then down the slope to exactly 3,000 feet depth, where they'd be anchored with deadweight moorings. Each installation required a cable-laying ship, divers' anchors weighing 3 tons apiece, and shore facilities with real-time signal processing equipment that didn't exist yet. The Office of Naval Research estimated costs in January 1951, $4.8 million per array installation, $1.2 million per year in maintenance and monitoring, 20 arrays minimum for Atlantic coverage. Total, $100 million to build, $24 million annually to operate. For comparison, a Fletcher-class destroyer cost $6 million and could be seen, touched, and understood by anyone who'd served in the Navy. Captain Rawson Bennett from the Submarine Warfare Division was the only senior officer who took Hunt seriously. Bennett had commanded diesel boats during the war and understood what the Soviets were building. In April 1951, he brought Hunt to a closed session of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy to explain SOFAR channel acoustics to congressmen who'd never heard of thermoclines or waveguides. Hunt spent 2 hours describing temperature gradients and pressure coefficients while senators checked their watches. Then Bennett asked one question. "Dr. Hunt, if the Soviets put 50 submarines in the Atlantic tomorrow, could we find them?" Hunt answered honestly, "Not with anything we have now, but yes, with this system, we'd hear everyone." The appropriation passed in July 1951, $12 million for a prototype installation, not the full network Hunt wanted, but enough to prove it could work. Hunt chose Eleuthera Island in the Bahamas for the prototype because the bathymetry was perfect. The continental shelf dropped away sharply 2 miles offshore, plunging from 200 feet to 6,000 feet in less than a mile. The SOFAR channel sat at 2,800 feet there, and the prevailing currents ran north-south, parallel to the major Soviet transit routes from Cuba toward the shipping lanes. If the system worked anywhere, it would work here. The cable ship John W. Weeks arrived off Eleuthera in January 1952 with 40 miles of custom hydrophone cable coiled in her hold. Each cable segment carried 12 hydrophones spaced 500 feet apart, bundled with power lines and signal wires inside a rubberized sheath 2 inches thick. The cable cost $180 per foot. Hunt watched from a chartered fishing boat as the Weeks crew lowered the first array, paying out cable at exactly 1.2 knots to prevent kinking. When the depth finder read 2,800 feet, divers released a 3-ton concrete anchor that dragged the cable to the seafloor and held it stationary against the current. The shore station went up in a Quonset hut. 300 yards from the beach, Hunt's team installed 24 analog signal processors, each one the size of a refrigerator, each one receiving input from a single hydrophone. The processors filtered out high-frequency noise, amplified the 7 to 200 Hz band where submarine machinery operated, and fed the cleaned signals into magnetic tape recorders running continuously at 7.5 inches per second. Every hour produced 450 feet of tape that had to be analyzed by hand. The array went operational on March 3, 1952. For the first week, Hunt's team heard exactly what the skeptics predicted: chaos. Whale songs at 1525 Hz, powerful enough to saturate the recorders, snapping shrimp creating broadband static, surface shipping, cargo vessels, tankers, fishing trawlers, producing propeller noise that showed up as fuzzy lines on the frequency plots, and something Hunt hadn't anticipated: biological noise from the deep scattering layer, millions of small organisms rising and falling with the day-night cycle, creating a constant background rumble like distant thunder. Hunt hired 3 acousticians from MIT to help process the tapes. They worked 8-hour shifts, running tape through a spectrum analyzer that displayed frequency content as glowing lines on an oscilloscope screen. Shipping traffic looked like sharp vertical spikes at 80 to 120 Hz. Whale songs showed up as complex harmonic patterns. Everything else was noise. By May, they'd logged 2,400 hours of continuous recording and identified exactly 0 submarines. The Navy sent a quiet observer in early June, a commander from the Submarine Warfare Division who spent 3 days watching Hunt's team analyze tape reels that showed nothing but merchant ships and marine life. He flew back to Washington and filed a report Hunt never saw, but the funding for additional arrays was quietly frozen. Hunt kept the system running through June and July, burning through $8,000 per month in magnetic tape and equipment maintenance. His team found 17 distinct whale populations, mapped shipping routes with unprecedented accuracy, and discovered that snapping shrimp stopped vocalizing during storms. None of it helped find submarines. On August 12, 1952, at 2:47 a.m., Hunt's night shift operator noticed something odd on hydrophone 7. It wasn't the usual shipping signature. Those showed up as clean tones at 90-110 Hz from propeller blade rates. This was messier. A broadband rumble centered around 30 Hz, with harmonics spreading up to 80 Hz. The signature had appeared suddenly 15 minutes earlier and was holding steady, neither approaching nor receding. The operator marked it on the log as unknown biological and kept recording. Hunt arrived at 6:30 a.m. for his regular morning review. He always checked the overnight logs first, looking for patterns the shift operators might have missed. The unknown biological entry caught his attention because it had lasted 4 hours without changing character. Whales didn't sit still for 4 hours. He pulled the tape and ran it through the spectrum analyzer. The fundamental frequency was 28 Hz, with strong harmonics at 56 Hz and 84 Hz, exact multiples, which meant mechanical origin, not biological. but the signature was buried under so much low-frequency noise that it barely registered above the background. Hunt spent an hour adjusting filter settings, cutting everything above 100 Hz and below 10 Hz, boosting the 20-50 Hz band by 12 decibels. The signature sharpened into focus, a rhythmic pulse at 28 Hz, steady as a metronome. He knew that rhythm. 6 months earlier, the Navy had sent him acoustic recordings from American diesel-electric boats running submerged. A Gato-class submarine at 6 knots, running on battery power, produced electric motor harmonics at 60 Hz, easy to hear. But there was always a secondary signature, quieter and lower, cavitation from the reduction gears that connected motors to propeller shafts. Those gears couldn't be silenced because they needed lubrication, and lubrication at depth meant tiny bubbles forming and collapsing in the gear housing. Cavitation, 20 to 40 Hz, depending on shaft rotation speed. Hunt pulled the Gato recordings and compared them to the Eleuthera signal. The pattern matched. Different fundamental frequency. The Gato ran at 35 Hz. This was 28 Hz. But the harmonic structure was identical. A diesel-electric submarine running submerged on batteries, somewhere within range of hydrophone 7. He needed bearing and distance. The array had 12 hydrophones spread over 6 miles of cable. Hunt pulled tapes from all 12, synchronized them, and ran a cross-correlation analysis, comparing when the same signal arrived at different hydrophones. Sound traveled through seawater at roughly 5,000 feet per second. A signal hitting hydrophone 7, then hydrophone 8 2 seconds later, meant the source was somewhere along a bearing line perpendicular to the cable. The math took 3 hours. When Hunt plotted the results, the contact was bearing 87 degrees, range 2 salvering to 320 miles. 300 miles away, and they were hearing it clearly enough to count gear rotations. Hunt called the Navy's Atlantic Fleet headquarters in Norfolk. A duty officer took the message, possible submarine contact, bearing 087 from Eleuthera, range 300 miles, detected via SOFAR array. Hunt gave them the timestamp and asked if any American boats were operating in that area. The response came back 40 minutes later. No U.S. submarines within 500 miles of that bearing, but naval intelligence had reports of a Soviet Whiskey-class boat transiting from Cuba toward open Atlantic. Last confirmed position, 280 miles east of Eleuthera, 6 hours ago. The Soviet contact changed everything. Within 3 weeks of Hunt's August detection, the Office of Naval Research released $28 million for additional array installations. The prototype had proven the concept. Submarines hundreds of miles away could be tracked continuously as long as they stayed submerged and ran machinery. The Navy wanted arrays covering every major Soviet transit route into the Atlantic. Hunt became project director for what the Navy designated Sound Surveillance System, sosus. Between October 1952 and December 1953, he supervised the design of standardized array packages that could be installed anywhere the SOFAR channel existed. Each array used 40 hydrophones instead of 12, spaced 200 feet apart along cable runs extending 8 miles from shore. The hydrophones themselves were redesigned. Ceramic cylinders 8 inches long, pressure rated to 6,000 feet, with frequency response optimized for 5 to 500 Hz. Western Electric manufactured them in batches of 200 at their New Jersey facility. Each unit tested for 6 months in pressurized salt water before approval. The first operational array went active off Barbados in March 1954, followed by installations at Bermuda and Antigua by September. Each location required surveying the continental shelf to find the ideal cable route, where the slope was gentle enough to prevent cable damage, but steep enough to reach SOFAR depth within 10 miles of shore. The cable ships had to work in weather windows between hurricanes, laying cable at precise speeds while maintaining exact depth measurements. One miscalculation, too fast and the cable kinked. Too slow, and it piled up on the seafloor in tangles. Hunt moved north in 1955, installing arrays at Cape Hatteras, Nantucket, and Nova Scotia. The northern stations presented new problems. Ice formation damaged surface buoys, winter storms tore loose anchor cables, and the SOFAR channel depth varied with seasonal temperature changes. At the Newfoundland installation in August 1955, Hunt's team had to replace 3 miles of cable after a trawler snagged it and dragged it 800 feet up the continental slope before the cable snapped. The shore stations evolved from the simple Quonset hut at Eleuthera into permanent facilities with 20-person crews running round-the-clock operations. By 1956, each station had 60 signal processors, 10 magnetic tape recorders, and a dedicated team of acoustic analysts trained to recognize submarine signatures. The analysts worked in soundproof rooms, headphones on, watching oscilloscope displays while listening to processed hydrophone feeds. A good analyst could distinguish a Soviet whiskey class from a Zulu class by the blade count on the propeller, 5 blades versus 6, which showed up as different harmonic spacing in the cavitation signature. The Greenland installation in July 1957 completed the Atlantic coverage. Hunt watched from the cable ship as the final array settled into place at 300 feet depth, 20 miles off the Greenland coast. The system now stretched from 61 degrees north latitude to 13 degrees north, a surveillance net spanning 3,000 miles that could detect any submarine transiting into or out of the Atlantic. 22 arrays, 880 hydrophones, 170 miles of cable, all feeding into shore stations that processed acoustic data 24 hours a day. The Soviets had no idea it existed. The network ran silently for 5 years, tracking routine Soviet submarine movements that never made headlines. Analysts logged transit times, mapped patrol patterns, and built acoustic libraries of individual boats. Each submarine had its own signature based on propeller blade damage, shaft alignment tolerances, and gear wear. By October 1962, SOSUS had cataloged 47 distinct Soviet diesel-electric submarines and could identify most of them within minutes of detection. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis began, and Hunt's underwater surveillance network became the only system that knew what was actually happening beneath the Atlantic. On October 22nd, President Kennedy announced the naval blockade of Cuba. The Soviets had 4 Foxtrot-class submarines already at sea, en route to the Caribbean to support the missile installations. Each Foxtrot displaced 2,475 tons submerged, carried 22 torpedoes, and could stay underwater for 10 days if the crew rationed battery power. Soviet Naval Command assumed these boats would slip through the blockade undetected, exactly as they'd done during peacetime transits for the past decade. SOSUS picked up the first Foxtrot on October 23rd at 11:40 p.m. Hydrophone Array 7 at Bermuda detected the distinctive 7-blade propeller signature at bearing 124 degrees, range 380 miles. The contact was designated S1 and tracked continuously as it moved southwest toward the Windward Passage at 8 knots submerged. Hunt was in the Bermuda shore station when the detection came through, and he watched the analysts plot S1's course on a clear acetate overlay, every hour adding another position fix as the submarine maintained steady speed and bearing. The second Foxtrot appeared on October 24th, detected by the Barbados array at 2:15 a.m. Contact S2, bearing 093 degrees, range 420 miles, heading west-northwest. By October 26th, SOSUS had all 4 Foxtrots plotted simultaneously. SM1 approaching the Windward Passage, S2 and S3 converging on the Old Bahama Channel, SBAV4 still 600 miles east of Barbados, but closing at 6 knots. The Navy sent destroyers to prosecute each contact, but they didn't need to hunt. SOSUS provided continuous position updates accurate to within 5 miles. The destroyers went straight to the coordinates, deployed sonobuoys, and forced the submarines to surface after 36 hours of harassment with active sonar and practice depth charges. All 4 Foxtrots surfaced between October 27th and October 30th, their batteries exhausted and crews near collapse from heat and carbon dioxide buildup. Hunt received a message from Admiral George Anderson Chief of Naval Operations, on November 2nd. Your system performed flawlessly. We held complete tactical advantage throughout the crisis. That was the entire message. No ceremony, no public recognition. SOSUS was still classified above top secret. Only 200 people in the Navy knew it existed, but Hunt had his vindication. For 13 days in October 1962, American destroyers had hunted Soviet submarines with perfect information, knowing exactly where each boat was at every moment. The Soviets never understood how they'd been found so easily, so consistently, in an ocean that was supposed to hide them. SOSUS expanded through the 1960s and 1970s into a global surveillance network. Hunt supervised installations in the Pacific by 1964, arrays off California, Hawaii, Guam, and Japan, creating coverage that mirrored the Atlantic system. By 1968, the network included 31 arrays worldwide, monitoring every major ocean transit route the Soviets could use. The cost had reached $240 million for infrastructure, with annual operating expenses of $35 million. It remained the most closely guarded secret in the U.S. Navy. The acoustic analysts became the true experts. By 1970, SOSUS stations employed over 400 trained operators who could distinguish individual submarines by mechanical quirks. A Yankee class with a damaged propeller blade that produced a distinctive 73 Hz spike. A November class with reduction gears that whined at 41 Hz instead of the standard 38 Hz. The analysts maintained handwritten logs tracking every Soviet boat, noting when submarines left port, where they patrolled, when they returned. Between 1962 and 1991, SOSUS detected and tracked over 200,000 submarine contacts. The Soviets knew something was wrong, but couldn't figure out what. Their submarines kept getting intercepted in open ocean, far from any American ships or aircraft. In 1965, Soviet naval intelligence began assuming the Americans had planted acoustic sensors somewhere. But they guessed wrong about the technology. They searched for active sonar arrays or advanced satellite systems. The idea that passive hydrophones sitting 3,000 feet down could hear submarines 500 miles away seemed physically impossible based on Soviet acoustic models. So they tried to build quieter submarines. The Victor class, introduced in 1967, featured rubber-coated hulls to absorb sonar pings and improved propeller designs to reduce cavitation. SOSUS picked them up at 420 miles instead of 500 miles, a marginal improvement that cost the Soviets billions in research and retooling. The Akula class in 1984 was even quieter, using pumpjet propulsion instead of traditional propellers. SOSUS detection range dropped to 200 miles, still more than enough. Hunt retired from active consultation in 1975 at age 71, though he maintained security clearance and occasionally reviewed SOSUS performance data. He died in 1984, never having published details about the system he'd built. SOSUS remained classified until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Navy finally acknowledged that yes, there were hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor, and yes, they'd been there since 1952. The declassification revealed the full scope. SOSUS had provided strategic intelligence on every Soviet submarine deployment for 30 years. It had tracked the first Soviet ballistic missile submarines in 1960, monitored their patrol patterns, and given the Navy confidence that Soviet boats couldn't launch surprise attacks from the Atlantic. During the entire Cold War, not one Soviet submarine had transited into American coastal waters without SOSUS detecting it. Frederick Hunt had found the one sound Soviet submarines couldn't hide: the unavoidable mechanical noise of engines and gears operating under pressure. The ocean wasn't random chaos that scattered sound unpredictably. It was a precision instrument that channeled acoustic energy across thousands of miles, and Hunt had learned to listen to it. The Soviets spent 40 years trying to build silence. They never succeeded.